Hello everybody, my name is Camila Torres and I am your instructor for this course. This is CEDC 705 and CEDC 705.5. The name of the course is Mathematics Curriculum Methods. Let's start with the purpose of this course. This course is designed to give you an opportunity to become knowledgeable on the fundamental skills and concepts that are related to mathematics curriculum at the elementary level. Also, you should come away with a very clear understanding of curriculum, teaching strategies, assessment techniques, and activities that will develop long-term relational understanding of mathematics concepts in children. At the end of the class, you will know, understand, and use major concepts, procedures, and reasoning processes of mathematics that define number systems and number sense, geometry, measurement, statistics, and probability, and algebra in order to foster students' understanding and use of patterns, quantities, and spatial relationships that represent phenomenon, solve problems, and manage data. So I've been teaching for a very long time. I'm starting my 24th year. During that time, I've seen the educational pendulum swing from one side to the other. There's always been new adoptions and new methods that have come into play. And depending on where I worked, various decisions were made based on what the new great thing was to teach mathematics. What I want to propose to you in this course is how a balanced approach is the best way to move forward so that we can apply the concepts and theories that have been established through empirical research and also prepare our students for the jobs of the future. Instead of starting at the beginning, let's instead start at the present and look towards the future. I want you to think to yourself, why should children study mathematics? Depending on which platform you're using, you'll be able to access the clip in various ways. If you have the Google slide open, you can just click on the link. If you're working on Blackboard, you can go to the next page and watch the clip there and return to this video immediately afterwards. Finally, if you're watching this on YouTube, you will find the link to this clip in the description box below. At this time, I'd like you to go ahead and pause this video and return to this timestamp once you've finished watching the clip, which is titled, Did You Know 2020? Immediately following the video, there will be a short journal prompt where you can document your thoughts or reactions to what you learned in the video clip. This video, the Did You Know video, has been circulating for several years. Every year they add things to it, they try to change it a little bit, but it's had this common trend in that it's making the argument consistently that jobs of the future are going to be more technologically based in a way that students will require a great deal of mathematics and science knowledge in order to be able to be competitive in the job market. Even in the last few months, as we've seen everything happen with the coronavirus, we've seen news show after program really diving into the statistics and the science behind the COVID virus. It's everywhere. For as many years as students have asked me, when am I going to use this stuff? Now is when you're going to use this stuff. As teachers, we want to make sure that our students have as many opportunities as possible. It's our job to prepare them for the jobs of the future. Think of the jobs that have been most celebrated in the last few months. Scientists, doctors, nurses, respiration therapists, statisticians, teachers. No student should consider themselves unable or incapable of pursuing their profession of choice because of their experience in mathematics. The National Center for Education Statistics, which is the research arm of the United States Department of Education, published a report in December 2019 that showed that the United States was improving in their math ranking. They had gone up from being ranked 35th worldwide in 2015 to being ranked 30th in 2018. We can see that there still is a lot more work to be done. The idea here is not for the United States to place first, but rather for the United States students to receive as comprehensive an experience with mathematics so that they are competitive with their peers throughout the world. Now that we've had a chance to situate what's happening in the present and what we anticipate will happen in the future with mathematics instruction, let's take a look at how we got here. What I will propose is that the gap that exists between mathematics instruction in the United States and mathematics instruction at some of the higher performing countries throughout the world is related to political, economic, and social factors in the United States throughout the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. Let's start by discussing who makes the decisions for our students' education. As you may already know, education is primarily a state and local responsibility in the United States. States can ask for federal funding. For example, Title I is part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provides financial assistance to schools with high numbers or high percentages of children from low-income families. This is done to ensure, or to try to ensure, that all children meet challenging state academic standards. These decisions are based primarily on census poverty estimates and the cost of education in each state. Any federal funding that a state receives is subject to any federal demands placed on that funding. In summary, based on the state's needs and their willingness to accept or adhere to federal demands, funding can vary substantially from state to state. The federal government's power to impose certain demands on states can actually force states into compliance, especially states with a greater percentage of students at a lower income level. So let's look at the major changes in mathematics curriculum and instruction that's taken place in the last 100 years. This graphic shows major changes, not all of which I will discuss in detail, that have contributed to the way that we view mathematics instruction and develop curriculum. There's been a huge swing of the pendulum from traditional approaches to more constructivist approaches. There's been a huge swing of the pendulum from traditional approaches to constructivist approaches, and all the while looking at how teachers are affected by the swing of the pendulum and how we've been able to adapt teacher credentialing or teacher professional development. Let's go back 100 years. 1920 is when the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics was founded. The official statement of the NCTM was updated just in 2017. The official statement now reads, "The National Council of Teachers of Mathematics advocates for high-quality mathematics teaching and learning for each and every student." The NCTM is a nonprofit organization that is independent of the federal government. It is the leading professional organization for teachers of mathematics in grades pre-K to 12. The NCTM provides broad national leadership in matters related to mathematics education, but they have no federal power. About 20 years after the establishment of the NCTM, the United States found itself in World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945. Throughout the war, the United States had found that they had very few soldiers that were able to do the simple mathematics necessary in order to lead effectively. For example, many of the troops were unable to do mathematics like calculate rates of travel, understand when one company could meet up with another company and where, read maps, calculate how much ammunition or supplies or food would be necessary for certain types of missions. We see this fact even in movies. In the movie Saving Private Ryan, a troop is sent out to bring back a soldier who is the only particular troop is led by Captain Miller. The reason why Captain Miller was chosen to be a captain instead of a non-commissioned officer was because he had college training. As an educated man, he had enough educational knowledge and likely mathematical skill to be able to lead his company to find Private Ryan and also attempt to keep them as safe as possible throughout the journey. The shortage of men capable of performing simple mathematical calculations concerned the government greatly. Towards the end of the war, they decided to take a closer look at what educational structures were in place so they could avoid this in the future. In your first Perusall assignment this week, you'll be able to read the NCTM's recommendation as part of their commission on the post-war plan. The NCTM was asked by the government and the military to propose the best way that the United States should start to develop mathematics curriculum so that it can meet the needs of the nation as a whole. As you read this, pay close attention to the groups that the NCTM identifies and in which ways their capabilities are best suited. The next major event that I will discuss happened about 15 years later during the Eisenhower administration in the early 1960s. At this time, the National Longitudinal Study of Mathematical Abilities began its work collecting information about the continuous process of developing math curriculum throughout the United States. The objectives of the study deal primarily with the relationship of many variables like attitude, textbook, teacher background, etc., to achievement measures in mathematics. This study was one of the first, if not the first, to look at teacher education as a correlation to student success. Prior to the study, it was assumed that student achievement was directly proportional to the number of general mathematics, pure mathematics, and applied mathematics coursework that the teacher had taken in college. However, the study showed that there was no significant difference between students whose teacher had at least taken calculus in college than students whose teacher had taken courses that were considered to be more advanced than calculus in college. Because of this, many teacher certification programs required prospective mathematics teachers to have completed calculus before entering any programs. It is believed that this requirement may have dissuaded many prospective mathematics teachers to enter the field. The National Longitudinal Study of Mathematical Abilities is also associated with the launch of new math. Instead of teaching math using drills and repeated practices, students were asked to start looking at math in a more abstract way that connected to real-world problem solving. The shift to new math was rejected by parents and by teachers alike. Parents were frustrated because they were unable to help their children and demanded that educators provide opportunities for additional tutoring or for workshops where parents could learn the new math themselves. Although mathematicians, educators, and politicians promoted new math as the means to regain the country's technological superiority during the Cold War, by the mid-70s, new math was considered to be a failure, and the Back to Basics movement began. The Back to Basics curriculum was mainly comprised of the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. The argument was that new math had left students without the basic computational proficiency needed for many technological careers. It was believed that new math had left students with weak foundations in arithmetic and other basic math skills, which would be more useful to the vast majority of students who would enter into the full variety of professions, businesses, technical jobs, and trades, or primarily wives and mothers. The Back to Basics movement also established a minimum competency for mathematics, demanding that all students should graduate from high school with at least an 8th grade math proficiency. Although this measure was met with pretty high success rate, several problems were identified with the model. From 1978 to 1986, several programs were evaluated that led to some interesting findings. Here are a few. When looking at the proportion of 9-year-olds operating at grade level, that percentage increased from about 70.3% to 73.9%. So pretty good increase. When looking at the proportions of 13-year-olds that were operating at an elementary level, that number increased from 94.5% to 98.5%. Okay, so also an increase there, right? There's an increase of students operating in at least an elementary level. However, when looking at 17-year-olds operating at a low level, middle school level, that number increased from 92% to 96%. Now, this is a 17-year-old operating at approximately a 13-year-old math level. However, when we looked at 17-year-olds that were able to do moderately complex middle school level math, that number decreased slightly by 51.4% to 51.1%. So you could argue it more or less stayed the same. In terms of students that were able to at least do high school level math, that number decreased from 74% to 64%. So there was a whole point difference of students that were able to do at least high school level math. So maybe algebra, geometry, that extent. It is important to note that gains were mostly observed in minorities. Professionals have looked at these results in varying ways. You could argue that more students were clearly meeting the benchmark that had been established, the low middle school level that was necessary for students to graduate from high school. You could argue that the way that the math was delivered, the Back to Basics curriculum, was attuned to the needs of minorities. For some reason, they were having the most success with it. However, you could also argue that the students that were already proficient in mathematics and did not have access to higher level mathematics. However, you could also argue that students that were already proficient at the 8th grade level did not have access or were not able to continue to develop their mathematical knowledge due to the low benchmark that had been placed. You could also argue that had the benchmark been raised higher, perhaps more students would have achieved that benchmark. In the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan had asked for a comprehensive study of the Back to Basics curriculum. This led to the Nation at Risk, an Imperative to Educational Reform report by T.H. Bell. In this report, he wrote, "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might as well have viewed it as an act of war." The report implied that because of so many years of the Back to Basics curriculum, that in attempts to hit a low standard for all students, we had done a disservice to the students in the United States by not making other opportunities available for them, like advanced mathematics courses. It also implied that the United States was not using what we knew about cognitive and developmental psychology in education. Additionally, T.H. Bell encouraged revisiting teacher competencies and teacher preparation to meet the demands that would be necessary in developing a new educational system. T.H. Bell implored state governments and the federal government to create an educational system that was akin to a full balanced meal instead of giving the American students scraps off the floor. Using the Nation at Risk report as a springboard, professors began to look more deeply into what exactly is needed for teachers to teach mathematics effectively. They narrowed it down to 3 constructs. First is content knowledge, then pedagogical content knowledge, and then curriculum knowledge. Content knowledge is just the actual doing of mathematics. So being able to execute operations and represent operations accurately. In other words, being able to solve math problems, regardless of how the problem is presented, correctly. The other is the pedagogical content knowledge, which are various ways of representing the same information to students so that they have different entry points in order to understand what's happening with the math. Perhaps at some point in your past, you had a professor or a teacher that was very good at mathematics, but had a hard time explaining it. A teacher that has pedagogical content knowledge and has been trained in pedagogical techniques that are useful in helping others understand the content, the math, is just as important as also having content knowledge. Finally, teachers need curriculum knowledge. Curriculum knowledge is how concepts or disciplines or skills are aligned both within a grade or lateral understandings, but also vertical understandings. So understanding how various concepts build from perhaps kindergarten to first grade to second grade and all the way up through middle school and high school. So having a very clear, comprehensive view of what is done at grade level and throughout a student's academic career. Mathematics curricular reform reached an all-time pace at this point. During the late 80s, what started to happen was what they called the math wars. And this was the push-pull between parents that had gone through the new math experience and then going back to the back to basics experience, were now seeing their children's pushed into this math reform that focused on different things. For example, the math reform that was seen in the late 80s was highly reliant on cognitive and developmental psychology of the students. It was based on conceptual understanding, so there was less emphasis on rote memorization and drill and kill type of instruction, and we saw an increased use of calculators and also math manipulatives. There was a decreased emphasis on direct instruction and increased emphasis on group dynamics, so students working in small groups and relying on one another and actually having conversations about mathematics. So just by looking at the classroom environment, what we used to see in the 70s and 80s were classrooms that were just a collection of individuals. The teacher was the sage on the stage, and there was a mere memorization of procedures. There was an emphasis on tricks and tips and mnemonic devices in order to do mathematics. And they were treating mathematics as a body of isolated concepts or procedures. In the 1980s, what they started to shift to is something that we see more often than not now. We see a classroom as a mathematic community, right? The tables are no longer, or the student desks are no longer in rows. A lot of the time you see them actually in little clusters so the students can work together. Students were asked to provide knowledge and argue and support their findings using mathematical evidence to verify answers. Students were regularly asked to explain their mathematical reasoning and offer alternative ways to solve problems. Finally, mathematical concepts were not seen as a linear progression. Rather, they were seen as an intricate web that were connected in various places through various skills and concepts. In 1994, there was another longitudinal study on educational gains by America's youth. In this study, the previous study of teachers' content area knowledge not needing to exceed a calculus math course in college was affirmed. However, the study did suggest that a teacher did not necessarily need to take calculus as the course. What they did find was that students' achievement increased proportionally to the number of math courses their teachers had taken up to the 5th course. So it didn't matter if calculus would have been one of those courses, so long as teachers had taken at least 5 math courses in college, we would see student achievement increase proportionally. This information was received at exactly the right moment. By the mid-1990s, about the time when I started teaching, it was reported that over 50,000 untrained teachers were entering teaching on emergency or incomplete licenses. If we were just looking at teachers teaching at the secondary level, many of them did not even have college minors in their content area, and approximately 30% of those were mathematics teachers. So about 7.5% of all untrained educators were math teachers. It's also important to note that lower socioeconomic schools had a greater proportion of teachers who were not adequately prepared to teach mathematics. And although the studies that we discussed in today's lecture determined that teachers did not need advanced math coursework, the national statistics showed that a huge percentage of teachers, not just untrained teachers, did not come close to meeting the threshold of completing at least 5 college classes suspected that made the difference. So what does the United States do when they know that teachers need so many math courses, so much math instruction themselves, and access to developing pedagogy, etc., in mathematics, when you have this huge influx of untrained teachers and huge population of teachers that never met that threshold? They were just working with the back to basics movement for so many years. So about this time is when they started to implement professional development with teachers at the district level. We started seeing math coaches appear. We started seeing in-services. These needs brought about regular professional training for teachers. So with that, let's go back to the Perusall real quick, and let me show you which one of those articles are also aligned with what we discussed in these last few slides. So here on Perusall, you'll see that you will have the following articles for you to read. This one, Knowing Mathematics for Teaching, goes into more depth about content, pedagogical, and curricular knowledge for teachers. The New York Times article asks, is algebra necessary? So you can give your points on that. The Devlin blog is a rebuttal to the New York Times article. And finally, this last article is just a short compilation of points and reports that address how minorities may be placed at a disadvantage when untrained teachers are fed into low socioeconomic schools. At this point, I'd like to give you an opportunity to go ahead and start your Perusall assignment. We will resume our discussion looking at the development of standards-based instruction at another time. As you work on your Perusall assignment, keep in mind that you can integrate a lot of what we talked about in this lecture with the Perusall articles in order to synthesize your theses for the Mathematics in the U.S. synthesis essay. Talk to you soon. Bye.